Okay, good afternoon and welcome back to our last session today at Justice Through Science, bringing modern DNA evidence into the courtroom. I hope you've been well educated and fed. We have another hour and a half to go with a cast of 7, not thousands. So I'm just going to quickly review some of what you've already heard. There was a report from the National Academy of Sciences in 2009 on strengthening forensic science, a path forward, and it talked about a number of issues in evidence, like human examination bias, which you've heard about today, statistics and reporting, and what is the underlying scientific basis of evidence. It's sort of one of the main areas that we don't hear enough of in court. Somebody says something that doesn't sound right as a scientific expert, the question should be from a prepared attorney is, what's the scientific basis for what you're saying, said in some prepared way? There's often none, which is what this report was about. And as Judge Ross had said, quoting on page 100, among existing forensic methods, the report said, only nuclear DNA is highly reliable. However, there may be problems with how the DNA was interpreted, such as when there are mixed samples. So I want to give you a 10-minute history of what's been happening. In the materials that you'll be sending us an email for, there's a paper that's coming out, I think it's in this month's Champion, the November DNA issue, that I wrote on basically DNA mixture failure. And it recounts the history in a more leisurely way, starting 30 years ago every 5 years, with like 50 references or so. But I'm not going to go into that level of detail here. This is just an overview. So as Greg showed us, going back to 2005, the forensic community was put on notice. They were told that their methods of interpreting DNA mixtures were not reproducible and were generally unreliable. This was a study that involved 69 crime labs. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and the Commerce Department had sent out the same 2-contributor mixture data to these different labs. They looked at it, and their match statistics were either can't interpret it, inconclusive, or for many of them, a low number in the tens of thousands, that's 4 zeros after the 1, or a bigger number, like hundreds of trillions, 14 zeros after the 1. This is on the same data. Okay, so if you're thinking about this as a lawyer, somebody was put on notice 12 years ago and not much happened, except that there was a lot of odd misinterpretation of DNA evidence. Some of the issues, which people like Greg Hampikian have written about and told you, is a biased DNA workflow. In most of science or technology, you put data into a machine, the machine thinks about it, and then an answer comes out. Right? You put something on the scale and you measure it. But what if your finger's on the scale? What if you get to control how much your finger's going to push on the scale? Well, then it's biased. It's not a measurement where you're using all the data. And that's exactly how most DNA mixture interpretation protocols have worked for the last 15 years and continue to work, even with newer fancy software. The analyst chooses their data. They're the expert. They know what's reliable and what's not reliable. We don't see that anywhere else in science, do we? I mean, you don't choose your hope. I guess as defense attorneys, you try to choose your evidence. But the idea is, if you have evidence, you don't throw out half of it. You don't choose to neglect. So the first step is choose the data. Which of these locus tests? Which peaks? What threshold? What data do you want to use? That's an interesting perspective. How many have heard of that before? Okay. And then a person decides, based on the protocol, whether someone is present or absent in the DNA. They make a human subjective decision about the answer. After a person's decided on the answer with the data that they've chosen, the last step on the right is to then put it into a computer and calculate a statistic. What if the statistic disagrees with their conclusion? Most crime lab protocols that I've seen say, well, the computer has to agree with scientific expectations. dial some parameters in, change the data, do it again, but make sure that you get a number that agrees with your expert opinion. So what we've been seeing in forensics over many types of software is software that basically is there to provide a number to agree with a subjective decision in the first place. Read the article in The Champion, you'll enjoy it. So as the NAS report said, by putting people in the process to overcome software limits. I mean, why are people doing all this? Because the software isn't powerful enough to do it on its own, for the most part. They introduce human bias. This was another study done by NIST, 2013, that Greg mentioned. It evolved over time with the numbers increasing. Greg got it at 106. This is at 100. 100 labs responded. And imagine a 3-person mixture, pretty straightforward, actually, if you look at the data. And 70%, 70 out of 100, falsely included a third person in a mixture. They would have helped give evidence to convict your innocent client. I'm trying to put it into normal language. Only 6 of the groups managed to exclude it, and some of them were benefited from more advanced technology. And a lot of the groups just said there's no information there at all. So this is exculpatory evidence that might have been reported as inculpatory. I'm just letting that settle in. So did this have an impact? Not for 10 years. I mean, people really weren't paying attention. And then an event happened where the FBI changed its way of, its recommendations or guidelines for interpreting evidence. It was clear the old way wasn't working with one threshold. Our approach with computers was to get rid of thresholds and put in a lot more mathematics. The FBI's approach was if one threshold doesn't work, use 2. And that failed miserably, actually, which is why there's new guidelines again this year. And the result of changing, and there's been papers written on this, I've written some papers, scientific studies on it, is that the match information vanished because it was an opportunity to start throwing out data. On any interesting mixture, on average, 1/3 of the tests were thrown out. So the average match statistic went from in the millions to the hundreds. That's 6 zeros down to 2 zeros. That's a factor of 3, with a lot of inconclusives. So it was a lot of panic. Crime labs did different things. Washington, D.C.'s lab was shut down for a while. Labs in Texas in 2015 started getting shut down. The problem is that for the first time, prosecutors began to see that there was something going on. In fact, in Texas, it was an integrity board within the DA's offices that were looking at this and asking, what is going on? And they began looking at maybe reanalyzing 25,000 cases in Texas alone. Why? Well, at Cybernetics, we had data from a lot of interesting studies. And there was one fact that had plagued us for a long time. Why was it that in study after study, state after state, county after county, the match statistic with combined probability of inclusion, which is the standard FBI software statistic for 15 years, was always 1 million? It's kind of like looking at your speedometer and it always says 37 miles an hour. You know car's not going. Or you know you're speeding, and it always says 37 miles an hour. How could that be true? Well, that's what it was like with CPI. It always said 1 million. We didn't understand it. And then, unlike a lot of opinion articles that we'd read, we got hold of some data and we studied it. And we compared these CPI methods with real, more informative computer methods. We asked what's going on. And we basically showed was that the CPI method was just a random counting procedure. It wasn't measuring information at all. In fact, I think the title of the paper says, inclusion probability, which is CPI, for DNA mixtures is subjective, one-sided match statistic unrelated to identification information. Subjective means however many tests that the analyst chooses to count. You take the number, on average, you take the number of tests, divide by 2, and it's that number of zeros in the match statistic. So for example, suppose there's 12 loci out of the 13 codis loci, and you look at 12 tests, divide by 2, that's 6. 1 followed by 6 zeros is 1 million. That turned out to be Y. It's basically a random number generator. that is just putting a number to an analyst's subjective impression of which tests are valid. In fact, if it's uncorrelated with identification information. That's what it is. This paper will be in the materials. It's also available free online. So I think many would agree, actually I'll be cross-examined on this later, but many would agree in government, in the federal government, that human mixture interpretation has been quite problematic in the past. It can be inaccurate. It disagrees with true information. It's subjective. There's a lot of human bias about which tests to even look at. It's widespread. It's affected hundreds of thousands of cases across the country. It's fairly opaque. Human decisions that are going on in somebody's head are affecting choices of data. And whatever they are is producing your match statistic in the end. And it's biased in an interesting way. These inclusion methods can only give an inclusionary statistic. They can't give an exclusionary statistic. So whereas more modern software can say that it's a chance of a match between evidence and a person is 1 in a million times less probable than a coincidence, and exclude somebody, which we've seen in cases a lot. These older methods can't do it. The number has to be, if you will, bigger than 1. It can never go less than 1. So a number of groups have been developing computer mixture interpretation methods. You've heard about TrueAllele. That's one method. These facts relate to that. TrueAllele is a Bayesian method which just works from the data and tries to get rid of human input and assumptions completely. Talking about the same 5 issues, it's accurate as measured by 34 validation studies that test its reliability, 7 of them published in peer-reviewed journals. It's objective in that the workflow just eliminates human bias. There isn't any because the computer analyzes evidence, only makes comparisons afterwards, and you can't play with it. You just put the data in. It's been accepted in that TrueAllele reports in over 40 states. It's used by crime labs. It's quite transparent, which we'll get into later, in that the math is disclosed, the software is given for review with a lot of other information and studies and data. And it's neutral. It can statistically include or exclude based on the data, not on what a person wants the answer to be or might think the answer might be. So you end up with informative results instead of inconclusive results. It's reasonably well accepted. It's been admitted after Fryer-Dorber challenge in every state it's been challenged in the US. There have been, I think, 13 challenges so far in the US as well as overseas. Crime labs use their own system in a number of states. We're not involved. There have been over 500 criminal cases that we've been involved in addition to what the crime labs have been, and it's used by both prosecution and defense. And at the latest count, it's been used in over 20 counties in Pennsylvania with a precedent from the Commonwealth versus Foley case from about 5 years ago. I want to give one example of a mixture from our county to show you what interpretation can do. We've done over 60 cases in the county for the DA's office. Some have produced exonerations or dropped charges. Most haven't. But the data are the data, right? We don't, whatever it is, it is. So here's an inconclusive mixture. There's a swab from a handgun. There's DNA data from at least 4 people who are contributors who left their DNA on that handgun. A lab can determine that. And because it's too complex for human analysis, the conclusion is no conclusions can be made. And that's the end of it. So what had actually happened in this case, the facts are fascinating. We have no time. Sorry. You'll hear other fascinating facts in a few minutes for a different case, for our mock trial. But essentially, you have 2 people who are accused of a crime, and you're going to trial regardless, and there's no physical evidence, and nobody knows what the DNA is showing. It's kind of like a crapshoot. Who knows what's going to happen? You just don't know. But imagine if you did know. And this is typical of the cases reanalyzed. The computer looks at at the data. On the bottom left is a handgun. What basically all TrueAllele does is it unmixes mixtures. So you start off with 4 people leave their DNA on a handgun, and after the computer's done, for each of the 4 people, you have their genotypes, known up to probability to represent uncertainty. And now you can make comparisons. First person is excluded, charges are dropped. He and Paul Boas are very happy, and off they go. And then the second person's included with a match statistic of hundreds of thousands. He pleads guilty, don't go to court. All the lawyers are happy, the judges are happy. I don't know if the defendant's happy, but whatever it is, that's what you end up with because you have evidence where before you didn't, because you could look more closely into the data. So that's the result of all this. So the one thing I've noticed in the over 50 trials I've been involved in and many hearings besides, is that generally lawyers are not mathematicians. Show of hands, anybody agree with that statement? Okay. But it's not that hard to litigate DNA evidence or complex DNA evidence. The issues have to do with more about the reliability and whether it's good or bad and how proven it is. You don't have to become a molecular biologist as a lawyer. And so we founded Justice Through Science this year as a nonprofit with feeling that scientists can provide reliable information, or some scientists can, and lawyers should ensure good science. Get in the good stuff, keep out the bad stuff in any field of forensics. And so what Justice Through Science is now offering are free CLE programs, like today, free DNA screening. If you have a DNA case, don't you want to know the information, maybe, to know what's really there? Maybe you don't, but maybe you do. We just have a donate button that was installed a week ago. If you want to make a contribution, that's great. Here's the website, justicethroughscience.org, and the mission is bringing better science into criminal justice through forensic education and public service. Today's mock trial will be underscoring many of these ideas. The mock trial will be presided by the Honorable Judge Sasinoski. Our prosecutor is DDA Robert Schupansky. Our defender is former Chief Public Defender Michael Machen. And we have a range of experts. We have investigator Brian Kohlhepp, and we have academic Lyndsie Ferrara. I'll be talking a little bit, and Jennifer Horniak as well. Okay, and again, if you haven't at this point written down the email address, conference@justicethroughscience.org, don't ask me afterwards, because that's the address. And if you want to get the materials, we're creating a Dropbox for everything this week, from the talks, the mock trials, the exhibits, the rulings, everything the speaker sent, and so on. So without further ado, let's get set up for our first witness. I'll leave that up. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Perlin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the time set for the matter of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania versus Donald Darnell. By way of background, February 1st of 2015, a man named Roger Wade was attending a retirement party for another individual named Howard Spector at the Lions Club in Pittsburgh. Mr. Darnell was also a patron at the Lions Club that evening. He was wearing a baseball cap. Around 3 o'clock that morning, Mr. Wade and Mr. Spencer left the Lions Club and began to walk down Oak Street. As Wade and Spencer were walking on Oak Street toward the cross street of 17th Street, an assailant approached Mr. Wade from behind, shot him once in the back of the head. Wade immediately fell to the ground. Spencer did not see his assailant, but instead fell to the ground also for cover when he heard the gunshot. After a few seconds, Mr. Spencer then tried to help Mr. Wade stand up. He then realized that Mr. Wade had been shot in the head and was fatally wounded. Mr. Wade was pronounced dead at the scene. He died as a result of a single gunshot wound to the head. The police were summoned as Officer Samuel Jones arrived at the scene on 17th Street. He saw the assailant running towards him with a gun in his hand and away from the area of the shooting.
assailant was wearing a baseball cap, just as Mr. Darnell was wearing at the Lions Club earlier that morning. Officer Jones immediately stopped his vehicle, exited, drew his revolver, and ordered the assailant to stop. The assailant ignored his commands and continued to run down Main Street. Officer Jones then pursued the assailant down the alley, continuously yelling for the assailant to stop. At some point, the assailant lost his footing, fell in front of a blue parked vehicle. Officer Jones took cover behind that vehicle, and as he approached the assailant, he came within approximately 10 feet of him and noticed that the hat that he had been wearing earlier was missing. The assailant continued to disobey Officer Jones' commands to remain still. The assailant managed to regain his footing and run away from the scene with Officer Jones in pursuit, who then observed Mr. Darnell climb over a fence and ultimately escape from the scene. Responding officers then recovered a firearm found next to the car where the assailant had fallen earlier, along with the hat from underneath the blue vehicle. The assailant fell near this vehicle earlier in the foot chase. A warrant was subsequently obtained in order to collect DNA evidence. DNA evidence was recovered from the hat, and it indicated that Mr. Darnell could not be excluded as a contributor. This is the case of Mr. Darnell. Those are the relevant facts that have been presented at earlier hearings in this matter. Of significant relevance here today, a ball cap and handgun were recovered from the scene where the defendant fell. They were admitted to the crime lab for analysis, and we're here to argue a motion that the defense has presented. Is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Michael Machen on behalf of Mr. Darnell. Mr. Schupansky and I have agreed to admit all exhibits, and they haven't been admitted into the record. That's the first issue. On the second issue, Your Honor, we have one pretrial motion still needs addressed, and it's a motion to eliminate. This is in addition to the brief that the defense has filed in this matter. We're arguing that true alleles does not pass the Fry test, Your Honor. It is not accepted in the general scientific community. In fact, it is your classic novel theory, and that's more apt for Daubert, which, Your Honor, obviously knows is not accepted in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Thank you, Your Honor.
Hey, Mr. Schupansky, do you wish to respond to that?
Yes, Your Honor. In response, the Commonwealth would direct the court to the case of Commonwealth versus James Foley, 2012, Pennsylvania Superior Court in 31. In the case of Commonwealth versus Foley, the Superior Court has, in fact, found true allele to be reliable and has admitted true allele as a DNA technology that can be used for analysis. So we rest on that case and argue that the motion to eliminate should be denied.
Okay, based upon that decision, Commonwealth versus Foley, as well as the rules of evidence, I believe it's 702, Fry is still applied in the Commonwealth. Mr. Machen, your motion is denied.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Do you wish to proceed at this point?
Yes, Your Honor. The Commonwealth would call Investigator Brian Kohlhepp. Please state your name for the record.
First name is Brian, last name is Kohlhepp, Kohlhepp, detective with Ross Township Police.
And Detective, do you have any training with respect to forensics and recovery of evidence?
I do. I've worked in our forensic investigation unit for about 13 years.
And can you detail for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what your training consists of?
I've gone through various training in crime scene and forensic processing. In addition to that, I teach crime scene and forensic processing at Duquesne University. I teach for John Jay in New York City. I teach for California University of PA in crime scene, advanced crime scene processing. I run a number of crime scene related courses for police officers and detectives, which have been accepted by the IAI for their crime scene certification and the state of Pennsylvania as continuing education for law enforcement officers.
were you called in and asked to respond to the scene of the shooting of Mr. Wade?
Yes.
And can you explain to ladies and gentlemen of the jury how you initially were called to the scene?
I was working that evening and heard the radio dispatch for officers to respond to a gunshots, possible male shot outside of the Lions Club. I responded to assist the patrol officers and eventually was assigned the duty of processing the crime scene.
And with respect to processing the crime scene, can you please explain to ladies and gentlemen on the jury what particular pieces of evidence that you were collecting and the nature of how you processed those particular pieces of evidence?
Sure. The scene was secured off and guarded so that we knew it was safe from entry from other persons. And we documented the scene through photography, through sketches, through measurements, looked for potential evidence, and recovered those items of evidence that we thought might be relevant to the case, which were later sent to the crime lab.
And were there any firearms recovered at the scene?
Yes, we located a firearm down the alley. It was about 65 feet from the Lions Club on the right side of the alley. It was 3 feet off of the building that would be to the right side of the alley. That would be north if you were looking on a map.
And I'm going to show you what's already been marked and submitted as College Exhibit number 1. Taking a look at that, is that the firearm that you recovered, sir?
I recognize this is the evidence envelope that I used at the scene based on my signature on the rear of it. Do get me small gloves. They're like OJ. Yes, this is the musket that was recovered at the scene. Based on the serial number here, on the brass ring, and the exhibit marker, and like I said, also from the envelope and the documentation information of my signature on it.
Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen what procedures you took to recover that particular musket?
Sure. As part of processing the crime scene, in addition to the documentation efforts that I mentioned earlier, recovering evidence, we were careful not to create any contamination issues, either from DNA that we're currently carrying or from the items that we recover there at the scene. So a number of steps are taken to ensure this, which can include wearing a mask so that we don't transmit evidence from ourselves onto it through our mouth, through coughing, sneezing, or even just talking around the evidence. Also, items of evidence are placed in their own individual bags. We double glove while processing the crime scene and be sure to change gloves between picking up items of evidence so that at no time am I wearing gloves touching one item of evidence and then wearing the same gloves touching a separate item of evidence.
I want to show you what's been marked as submitted as column number 2. Can you identify that for us?
Yes, I recognize this envelope from the markings I put on as well as my signature on the back. This is the baseball cap that we recovered that we believe the suspect to have been wearing at the time. Labeled District Attorney. Maybe we should speak about where you were that evening.
Now, you indicated that you wear gloves and masks. Can you describe what steps you took to keep these two items separated?
Sure. As soon as the items are recovered, they're immediately placed into a paper bag so that it's breathable, so that any moisture in there can evaporate away and not cause any contamination issues into the DNA through the growth of bacteria or mold on the items. So we package them into paper bags immediately and separately. These are items of evidence which aren't going to be processed at all by my police department or in our crime laboratory because we don't do the DNA processing. So they're immediately taken to the lab after being sealed in these bags. They're never again taken out of this bag until they're done so at the crime laboratory.
And separate bags were used for each item?
Correct. Separate bags were used for every item of evidence collected from the scene.
And separate gloves as you handled each item?
Correct. Gloves were changed anytime when I touched the different item of evidence or item that could be evidentiary or any crime scene equipment that I would have there at the scene that transfers from one scene to another.
And final question, the shell casing that was found at the scene, did that match the musket that you identified as College Exhibit number 1?
Yes, one lead ball was recovered and it did match said musket.
I'd offer the witness for cross.
We had talked earlier about not crossing the police officer because he seems to melt a lot. That's why we're not going to cross him, but we're going to continue with this. This is where you have the classic case, the situation where the body suits, gloves, tongs, and one of the things you've seen across the nation now is whether people collect their gloves, collect their tongs, collect their body suits, to see if there have been any DNA on all those items that were not collected at the scene in respect to the hat and the handgun. But for now, we'll just continue with this matter. Thank you, Detective.
Thank you.
Yes, the Commonwealth would call a scientist, Lyndsie Ferrara. Ms. Ferrara, can you please state your full name and spell it for the court?
Lyndsie Ferrara, Ferrara.
And Ms. Ferrara, can you tell us what training and experience you have in DNA analysis and interpretation?
At this time, we would probably, especially since Ms. Ferrara has already testified in the court of common pleas on numerous occasions, we would stipulate to her qualifications. But the most important thing is you can go through 11 to 13 bases for qualification of an expert, but this time the defense would stipulate to Ms. Ferrara's qualifications.
The Commonwealth would accept that. Yes, we accept the stipulation, Your Honor. Ms. Ferrara, did you produce a PowerPoint presentation that would aid in your presentation here today in your descriptions of DNA?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, I would mark the PowerPoint presentation as Commonwealth Exhibit number 3. I believe that defense counsel and I have a stipulation that we're going to use that PowerPoint presentation to assist in the testimony of Ms. Ferrara.
Any objection?
No objections, Your Honor.
Ms. Ferrara, we start off with asking you, can you please tell ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what is DNA?
Sure. So first we'll start off with a cell. And in our bodies we have trillions of cells. And you'll notice on the left-hand side of the slide, that indicates a cell, and the center is the nucleus. Within the nucleus, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes. Half come from your mother, half come from your father. And when you stretch that chromosome out, that essentially shows you the DNA information. And you can think of that as a long string of text. It's made up of 4 DNA letters that the scientist can read. Also, it's important to note that in forensics, we look at certain locations. These are also referred to as loci, or singularly, a locus.
Now, why is it that there's certain locations are looked at with respect to DNA analysis?
There's a large part of the DNA that is similar between all of us, but at certain locations, there are variations that allow us to identify each other.
And moving on to the next slide, can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what a short tandem repeat is and how that's used in terms of identification and using DNA to get an identification?
Yes, a short tandem repeat is essentially a short DNA word that is repeated numerous times at these locations we look at. So one way to think of it as, think of the chromosomes as encyclopedias. And if we pull out one encyclopedia, we look at one chromosome, we want to look at one location, which would be a paragraph. So on the screen, you'll notice it's a paragraph, the Take Me Out to the Ball Game song. And within the song, the word root is repeated a number of times. So root would be essentially a short tandem repeat. In this example, the word is repeated 10 times, and based on that repeat length, we know how long that should be. We know how long that paragraph is. And we would call that an allele. This allele represents 10 repeat units, and that's what varies between people. So at one location, you could have a repeat unit of 10 from your mother and an 11 from your father.
So is it fair to say that you have one allele from one parent and one allele from another parent?
Correct, and these alleles can be different at a location or they can be the same length.
Now, did you have an opportunity to analyze Commonwealth Exhibit number 1, the musket, and Commonwealth Exhibit number 2, the hat?
Yes, I did.
And can you explain at the lab what transpired with each of those pieces of evidence in terms of getting DNA evidence off of those items?
Sure. I swabbed each of the items of evidence to collect the DNA sample. From that, I went through an extraction process, which essentially gets only the DNA material into a solution that I can work with. From there, I determine how much is present, and then I make millions of copies of only the locations we're interested in. So essentially, we look at 16 locations.
And each of these items was processed separately?
Yes, each was processed separately. And then after you amplify, you actually separate them as well to generate a DNA profile based on their size.
What's the profile generated look like when it comes out of the computer?
So the profile is essentially a picture that gives us peaks. This is referred to as an electropherogram. Here we have a picture at just one location, and you'll notice along the horizontal axis that determines the size. And again, based on the size, we know how many repeat units there are. So for each peak, they're labeled. So the first peak is labeled as 14. That means there's 14 repeat units. And then you also notice the peaks have a certain size, and the size relates back to the relative quantity of DNA that is present.
So these electropherograms, the one that's posted up on the screen for ladies and gentlemen on the jury, this is what the computer generates after it analyzes the biological material that you put into the system.
Correct.
Now, moving on to your next slide, can you explain to ladies and gentlemen how you take those electropherograms and that information and then interpret that data?
Sure. So initially what is done is we apply an analytical threshold. And that threshold ensures that we are only looking at peaks that are truly related to the DNA and not any other artifacts. After that, in terms of a mixture, I try to evaluate if I can separate out any major minor contributors. For example, in this, you could say that the 16 and 17 are associated alleles, and the 14 and 15 are associated alleles from a different person.
And how can you say that those are associated alleles looking at that the electropherogram?
Again, it's based on the size. So based on the size of these peaks, they're different enough in size where you can show that the two larger ones would pair together and the two smaller ones would pair together. Now this is just one representation. In some mixtures, you're unable to determine which two alleles came from which contributor.
And you mentioned a threshold. Can you just briefly explain to ladies and gentlemen where the threshold comes from?
Sure. So the thresholds we apply come through our validation. We do mini tests and a validation to ensure that where we have our threshold set, we're including true DNA peaks and then excluding peaks that could be artifacts.
And can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen, what is a match statistic and what are the statistics that you found with respect to both the gun and the hat in this case?
So a match statistic essentially applies a weight of the evidence, a weight of the match. So two different match statistics were calculated in this case. For the musket, I was unable to separate out the contributors, a major and minor. Therefore, I calculated a combined probability of inclusion statistic. And I determined Mr. Darnell is included as a potential contributor to the mixture. The probability of randomly selecting another individual who would be included is 1 in 420 in the black population, 1 in 500 in the Caucasian population, and 1 in 470 in the Hispanic population. For the hat, I was able to separate out a major and minor contributor, and the major profile obtained matches Mr. Darnell, and the probability of randomly selecting another individual with the same DNA profile as the hat in the black population is 1 in 5.7 quadrillion. In the Caucasian population, 1 in 9.3 quadrillion, and in the Hispanic population, 1 in 1.8 quadrillion. And the statistic for the hat was calculated using a random match probability.
And you mentioned separating out mixtures. How many different individuals could have been on that gun based on the statistics and your findings?
At least 2.
And how many on the hat?
Again, there were at least 2.
And are all your findings to a specific degree of scientific certainty?
Yes.
I don't cross.
Good afternoon, Ms. Ferrara. You would agree that you did calculate a match between the handgun and hat and with Mr. Darnell, correct?
Correct.
You would agree that this was done using what's called the combined probability of inclusion method, also known as CPI, correct?
I did use the CPI statistic for the gun, yes.
And what is CPI?
So essentially, CPI would be explained as, in this case, the statistic for one population was 1 in 420. So if you were to take a room of 420 people, theoretically, one of those individuals would be included in the mixture.
So you would agree with me that the CPI method has not been empirically validated, correct?
That I'm not sure of.
If you're not sure, but it's still being used in your crime lab, but you're not sure it's been empirically validated, correct?
Correct.
You'd agree that your crime lab has not tested the validity of the CPI match statistics, correct?
We have validated all of our protocols, but I'm not sure to the specificity that you're asking.
So the specificity is you have not validated that in your own crime lab, though, correct?
Not that I'm aware of.
You would agree that Dr. John Butler is accepted in the scientific community as a DNA expert, correct?
Correct.
If you're looking at the screen behind you, are you familiar with Dr. Butler's MIX-05 study, please?
I am.
You would agree that his study tested CPI on the same DNA mixtures data across different crime labs, correct?
Yes.
So that means that Dr. Butler gave this mixture to many crime labs and said, okay, let's CPI it, correct? In a simple layman's term.
He essentially sent out the mixture and told each laboratory to interpret it based on their protocols.
Okay, you would agree that there was extreme variations, correct?
Yes, in this study there did show that.
You would agree that the smallest CPI was 31,000, correct?
Correct.
As you're looking at the screen behind you.
Yes.
Okay, or in front of you, sorry. And you would agree the largest was 213 trillion?
Yes.
I did bring my calculator and I did talk. You would agree that the values vary by a factor of 10 billion.
Yes.
Can you say that one more time, please? 10 billion, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You would agree there are 15 STR, short tandem repeat genetic locations on the handgun, correct?
Correct.
You would agree that you reported a CPI statistic based upon 8 of the 15 loci, correct?
Yes, I was only able to use 8 of the loci based on our interpretation threshold to calculate an inclusion statistic.
So you would agree that you discarded 7 STR genetic locations.
When calculating the statistics, yes.
So you would agree that you made a choice of what loci data to use with the CPI, correct?
Yes, based on our protocols.
Right. But your protocols are based upon something that was never validated, as you indicated earlier in your cross-examination, correct, Ms. Ferrara? We'll proceed. We'll go back to that question. You would agree that different data choices would yield different CPI match statistics, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You would agree that Dr. Graham Picking is a DNA authority and you read his article on the screen, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Please turn. You would agree that the title of the paper is Subjectivity and Bias in Forensic DNA Mixture Interpretation, correct?
Yes.
Would you please read the summary from Dr. Pickingham, please?
Sure. DNA mixture interpretation is subjective and may be susceptible to bias by extraneous context, as evidenced by conflicting conclusions concerning the inclusion or exclusion of suspects.
Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, based on what was found in this study, yes.
So you basically stated you would agree that DNA analysts can reach conflicting match conclusions, correct?
Yes.
You would agree that CPI match statistics is supposed to be related to identification information, correct?
Correct.
But you would agree that a higher CPI number means a stronger DNA association, correct?
Yes.
Okay. But would you agree with me that there is no scientific basis for connecting CPI to match information?
Not that I'm aware of.
You would agree that you're familiar with Dr. Mark Perlin, a noted authority in DNA, and his work in DNA match statistics, correct?
Correct.
And as you see his article on the screen behind you, which has been marked exhibit and admitted prior to this, you would agree that you read his study, correct?
Correct.
Would you please read the title?
Inclusion probability for DNA mixtures is a subjective, one-sided match statistic unrelated to identification information.
Would you agree with me that this is the same inclusion probability you use in your CPI statistics?
Yes, it is.
So you would agree that one-sided is inclusion, not exclusion, correct?
Correct.
So you would agree that Dr. Perlin's paper is based on actual DNA mixture, correct?
Yes.
So please turn to the screen. Would you please identify what this is on the screen behind you, Professor Ferrara?
This is one of the scatter plots displayed in this paper.
So you would agree that it compares inclusion probability with actual identification information, correct?
Yes.
They're on a different axis, correct?
Correct.
You would agree that there is little correlation between inclusion probability and identification information, correct?
Yes, that is what the scatter plot displays.
So not in conclusion, but you would agree that the CPI is little more than a random number generator, correct?
That is what the paper stated.
Well, let's step back a little bit. You said you agreed with the paper, correct, Professor Ferrara?
I said I read the paper.
And did you say, well, okay, and you did not disagree with the conclusion of Dr. Mark Perlin, correct?
Which conclusion?
The conclusion is that CPI is little more than a random number generator based upon the exhibit behind you, which has been marked exhibit, let's say 66. Well, here, we'll strike that question. Let's go back again. You're looking at the screen and you're looking at these two axes and you're looking at a scatter plot. You would agree with me, you do not disagree with the scatter plot as shown before you.
No, the information depicted is based on the information presented in the paper.
So once again, you would agree that the CPI in this is a little more than a random number generator, correct?
Objection asked and answered.
Excuse me, I did not even bother him when he led the question for 66 times.
We had an agreement there. We don't object, but I can only hold my tongue so long.
We went back and forth, though. Judge, are you going to ask Mrs. Ferrara to doesn't Ms. I would ask the Zoning Court to ask Ms. Ferrara to answer, Professor Ferrara to answer the question.
We could ask it one more time.
Professor Ferrara.
Yes.
You would agree that the CPI is you look at the scatter plot, is little more than a random number generator, correct?
Correct, based on the data presented in the paper.
Thank you very much. You would agree, you read a second article by Mark Perlin, and it's titled Failing to Interpret DNA Evidence, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree after reading this article that many in the forensic science community do not accept CPI as a reliable match statistic, correct?
Yes.
Isn't it true you wrote an article called Landscape Study of DNA Mixture Interpretation Software?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And that's there it is. You would agree agree that the substance of your paper is additional ways of interpreting DNA mixture, including using peak height data, correct?
Correct.
What is peak height data?
Peak height data is essentially related to the amount of DNA present.
You would also agree that peak height data is not used in CPI math statistics, correct?
It's used in the initial evaluation of the profile, but correct, it's not used for the statistic.
And as you indicated in 2 questions ago, in part of your paper is that when you're interpreting DNA mixtures, peak height data is very important, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So you would agree that peak height data may be helpful for inclusion of DNA mixtures, correct?
Correct.
And you would agree that peak height data is more informative, correct?
Correct.
And you would agree that your crime lab does not use peak height data and therefore does not exclude, correct?
No, that's not true. We use multiple statistical methods, but for the gun specifically, using the CPI stat, we did not use the peak height data.
And your testimony was within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. I have no other questions, Professor.
Mr. Schupansky, do you have any?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you.
The column from call Dr. Mark Perlin. Doctor, can you please state your full name and spell it for the record?
Mark Perlin, Markperlin.
And Doctor, did you prepare a PowerPoint presentation that would assist the ladies and gentlemen of the jury to understand your testimony here today?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, I've marked as column statement number 4 the PowerPoint presentation, and defense counsel and I have a stipulation that it will be used during Dr. Perlin's presentation.
Is that correct, Mr. Mack?
That is correct, Your Honor.
All right, you may proceed.
Doctor, can you please explain to ladies and gentlemen of the jury what your background is in respect to DNA analysis?
I would definitely stipulate to that because we may be here till 12 o'clock tonight. With all due respect, though.
And because it is Friday, I will agree to the stipulation, but in court I would not. And Doctor, were you called in to assist in the interpretation of DNA information in the Luke Darnell matter?
Yes, I was.
And can you explain, with respect to your interpretation, do you physically analyze the items, in this case the hat and the gun?
No, we don't handle the items. The crime lab gets the items and transforms the biological evidence into data signals, and we take those electronic data files that are the signals. That's our starting point.
So the actual data signals were the ones that Professor Ferrara testified that she obtained during the analysis of the hat and the gun.
Correct.
And can you please explain to the ladies and gentlemen what a genotype is?
A genotype is a pair of alleles. It's the main unit of identification. On the left side of the slide, we see that if there's a mother allele that has 8 repeats and a father allele that has 9 repeats, that pairing of the 2 alleles from mother and father is an 8 and a 9. The reason that's important is that when you have many alleles, you have variation, but with many pairs of alleles, you have far more variation. If you have 10 alleles, you have about 50 pairs of alleles, and that can better distinguish between people.
And when you're analyzing DNA, specifically alleles of information that's recovered on evidence, can you explain your method of interpretation and how that's a little bit different than the other lab interpretation that we heard about earlier today?
Yes, so the figure shows a mixture on the left in a blue and gold that represents 2 different people's DNA. The laboratory extracts, amplifies, and separates the DNA at 15 different locations to produce a signal. And shown in the center is that signal of a low peak, and a high peak. The numbers underneath it correspond to the different lengths or alleles, the sizes, the 10, 11, and the 12. That's the same starting point for both what Professor Ferrara's lab does and what we do at cybergenetics. But instead of drawing a threshold, which may or may not capture the data and will usually discard peak height information, instead what the computer can do is to separate that mixed data and unmix it into the two different genotypes corresponding to the two different people who left their DNA. So here what we see after that separation for one of the contributors at one location is a genotype. There are about 100 possible values of genotype, say 5'5", 5'6", 5'7", and so on. And here what the data are showing in the simplified form is support for three different genotypes, a 10-12, an 11-12, and a 12-12, along with the different probabilities that the data are telling us that these genotype values can have. So once there's uncertainty, instead of having one definite allele pair, the computer considers all possible allele pairs and puts probabilities to them. That's the major difference, is that separation, locus by locus, and putting probabilities to the possibilities. Afterwards, a comparison can be made to any individual to determine the extent of match.
Now, you mentioned peak heights and in the mixture. If we move to the next slide, can you explain the significance of peak heights and how cybergenetics uses those in its interpretation?
Yes, this is the original data for one of the 15 short tandem repeat locations that came from the laboratory's analyzer. On the horizontal axis, we see the different sizes, how many letters are in the paragraph. The numbers on top indicate the number of repeats, or alleles, 14, 15, 16, and 17. The heights reflect the quantity of each allele that was detected by the genetic analyzer machine. Taller peaks correspond to more quantity, more of those alleles, whereas lower peaks correspond to fewer copies of the DNA, to less DNA at that allele. And what's important for a computer analysis is to use all the information, the highs and the lows, and to see whether they're high or low. It's to look at the pattern. For example, we see a 14 and a 15 that are low, and a 16 and a 17 that are high. There's a pattern of different peak heights. And then from that information, a computer can do what people can't do at all, which is to calculate the variation statistically in the data patterns.
And moving on to the next slide, continuing our discussion about peak patterns, can you explain how thresholds, which were mentioned when Professor Ferrara testified, are or are not used in how the computer, as you have in your slide, thinks?
Thresholds are not used at all. It's not the case that some peaks are kept, some are thrown out, and then they're all given equal status as in or out. Instead, what the computer does is it tries out maybe 10,000 or 100,000 different explanations of the data at each location. Here's one of those 100,000 explanations. In blue, in the center, we see two tall peaks that the computer is proposing. What if there's a lot of a 16-17 allele pair, shown in blue? And to the left of that, what if there's another person's allele pair in orange that's a lesser amount, a minor contributor of a 14-15? And what if there's a third person with even less DNA out at peak 21, shown in green? A pattern like this explains the data. The heights of those rectangles, of those three different genotypes, when looked at as a pattern, have the same highs and lows as the original data. And when there is a better correspondence of the proposed pattern to the data, that confers a higher probability to each of those three genotypes. When the proposed pattern looks nothing like the data, that has very low probability. And when it's in between, the probabilities are in between. And so by trying this out for 100,000 different possible explanations, the computer can work out what the probabilities are of every possible allele pair for each contributor, each of these three colors, at each of the tested loci.
And moving on to the next slide, you mentioned the probabilities of the different allele pairs. Does this particular slide show the probabilities of the allele pair that we were just looking at with respect to the electropherogram on the prior slide?
Yes, it does. Out of the 100 or so possible allele pairs, the most probable ones are listed. Those 6 are on the bottom axis of different allele pairs. The y-axis is the probability, and we see that there are some lower probability events. The lowest ones are not shown. They would stretch across the courtroom. And that pairing of the 16-17 that we saw of the major contributor, for this major contributor, has 91% probability. Any of these possibilities could be the case, but these are the probabilities that the computer assigns to them based solely on the data.
Now, taking that data and moving to the next slide, can you explain how those probabilities are used to get a DNA match statistic?
Yes, what a match statistic is, it's a comparison of the probability of a match between evidence and an individual relative to coincidence. That probability can be calculated, or that ratio of probabilities can be calculated for any person. For example, if we were to look all the way on the left, where there's a 14-16 allele pair, we see the same blue pattern of the probability of a 14-16, but now there's a brown bar. What those brown bars represent is the chance of a coincidental match. What's the prevalence of these different allele pairs in the human population? So those are low background probabilities, but a match statistic is a ratio of those probabilities of the blue bar to the brown bar at any possible allele pair. Looking at the one all the way on the left, that 14-16, we see that the brown bar is twice as tall as the blue bar. That means coincidence is more probable than a match. And that would lead to a number less than 1 that would be more exclusionary. On the other hand, what we see at the circled allele pair in red, 16-17, at that particular allele pair, which happens to correspond to Luke Darnell's genotype at this location, is that the probability of that genotype of a match between the gun and Mr. Darnell is at 91%, whereas the chance of a coincidence is, the brown bar is down at 11%. That ratio of the probability of a match between evidence and a person divided by coincidence at Mr. Darnell's genotype is 91% divided by 11%, which is 8. So the match statistic, the likelihood ratio at this one location of 15 is 8, just by taking the ratio of after in blue to before in brown at this one person's allele pair.
Now, using true alleles methods, were you able to look at more loci than what was looked at previously that we talked about earlier?
Yes, whereas the human review was able to look at 8 out of the 15 loci, the computer has no such choice. It's forced to look at all the data. Some may be more inclusionary, some may have a more exclusionary statistic, and it's only by combining all of those match statistics across all of the evidence that we can arrive at the total match statistic.
Now, using your methodologies and looking at all the loci, can you tell us what your findings were with respect to the handgun and Luke Darnell's profile?
Yes, multiplying all those match probabilities, multiplying all those match statistics, those likelihood ratios together across all 15 locations, we arrived at a number for each different ethnic group. Each different ethnic group represents the different brown bars. There's a different concept of random for each ethnic group. And so we could conclude that a match between the handgun and Luke Darnell was 18.6 billion times more probable than a coincidental match for an African American population. And there are other statistics for 3 other ethnic groups. Would you like me to read them?
No, going on to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Were you also able to get a match statistic for the hat?
Yes, separating out the 3 genotypes and then comparing them with Mr. Darnell, we were able to calculate match statistics as shown as the right under the baseball cap, that a match between the baseball cap and Mr. Darnell was 89 quadrillion times more probable than a coincidental match relative to an African American population, with similar numbers of that order of magnitude with respect to Caucasian and Hispanic populations.
So TrueAllele was, using TrueAllele, you were able to match Mr. Darnell, at least his profile, to both the gun and the hat.
We're able to calculate a match statistic, which was inclusionary, that expressed the strength of that inclusionary association.
Now, the data also had 2 other individuals on the gun and 2 others on the hat, correct?
Yes, each was a 3-contributor mixture.
Now, were you able, using TrueAllele, to do an analysis of evidence to evidence?
Yes, in TrueAllele, a genotype is just the genotype. The same way we can look at the probability, we can compare a handgun genotype that's been separated to a defendant or a person. We can also compare a separated evidence genotype to a separated evidence genotype. For example, if we separate 3 genotypes from a handgun and also separate 3 genotypes from a hat, we can compare all of those genotypes, 3 times 3 or the 9 possibilities, in order to calculate match statistics.
And when I asked you if you could take a look at the 2 other unknowns on the gun and the 2 other unknowns on the hat to compare them to see if any other individual would be on both, were you able to do that?
Yes, by comparing all 3 separated genotypes from the handgun to all 3 separated genotypes from the hat, we're able to show that while the 63% major fraction from the handgun did produce a level of a billion match statistic with the hat, comparing evidence to evidence, there was no support for a match between any other pairs of contributors from these 2 different items of evidence. So basically, there's no indication that anyone other than Luke Darnell contributed their DNA to both items of evidence.
And are your findings to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, Doctor?
Yes, they are.
Offer the witness for cross.
Good afternoon, Dr. Perlin.
Good afternoon, Mr. Machen.
You would agree with me that forensic methods such as DNA testing shall be transparent, correct?
Yes, they should.
And you would agree that your software/hardware of TrueAllele should be discoverable for testing by defense counsel, correct?
Yes, I would agree that testing is very important in science, yes.
And you would agree that TrueAllele results are based strictly on data received from the crime lab, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you indicated in some of your prior writings that you have, I guess, not an allegiance to the CPI match statistic, correct?
It's true, I have no allegiance to the CPI match statistic.
Because you would agree with me, you just don't believe in the quality of the CPI match statistic, correct?
I've never seen a validation that has supported its validity, correct?
But you would agree with me that the crime lab in this matter that's using CPI is the same crime lab that's submitting data to you, correct?
Yes, we start from the same data. It's just interpreted with different methods.
So once again, you don't believe in CPI from the crime lab, but you'll still take their data, correct?
They're excellent at producing data. They're not excellent at producing match statistics.
Wow, so you can go from A to B without having a hesitation. Okay, we'll move on. Sorry, Your Honor. You would agree with me that you have not reviewed the detective's report of the collection of the gun at the scene, correct?
That's correct.
Nor the collection of the hat at the scene, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You would agree that you have not reviewed the policy for the collection of the DNA from the gun or the hat by the crime lab, correct?
That's correct.
You would agree that you have not asked the criminalist how he or she collected the DNA, correct?
Well, they didn't collect it, but I didn't ask them anyway.
But you did not talk to the criminalist at all in this matter, correct?
Actually, in this matter, we did, but...
Was that via voice, email, text, or all the above?
We had a meeting at the crime lab.
Okay. And you were able to see, you would agree you did not see this criminalist operate the genetic analyzer, correct?
No, I did not observe what happened inside the crime lab.
And you would agree with me, you did not pull the data from the genetic analyzer, correct?
No, I didn't put the data on, nor did I pull the data off.
And you don't even know the policy, you would agree you don't even know the policy of the crime lab, how they operate the genetic analyzer, correct?
Well, no, we actually know exactly how they operate the genetic analyzer because on their recommendation, we bought one 15 years ago and operated it in our office.
But on that day in question, when they pulled the data from the genetic analyzer, you agree with me, you weren't there.
Was not there.
You did not see the person who did the analyzing in the genetic analyzer, correct?
That's
so
correct.
You can obviously state at this time that you have no idea whether they followed policy.
The data looked excellent, and that's...
Your Honor, I would ask you to instruct Dr. Perlin to answer the question posed to him. Okay, thank you, Your Honor. You would agree you're unable to state when the last DNA in the mixture was deposited on the gun, correct?
No, DNA doesn't give us that type of information, correct?
And you would agree that you do not know which of the 3 DNA types of the mixture was the last to be deposited on the gun, correct?
That's correct. There are some studies that suggest that the highest amount in major contributor is more often the last one, but it's not necessarily so.
But you would agree in this matter here, you have no idea what was the last of the 3 mixtures of DNA was deposited on the gun.
I can't state that with certainty.
I have no other questions, Your Honor. And at this time, we would have called Dr. Jennifer Horniak for the defense, but Rob and I are fearful that people would rush us and beat us up because it's 4:30. So with that, unfortunately, I've been pushed to rest. I apologize, but I want to, but thank you.
Okay, so you can all rest as well. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for staying and your enthusiasm. Again, the materials will be available if you send an email. And Roosevelt may have a few more books. And thank you very much again for coming.